Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining WEIM Resource Efficiency Evaluation Enhancements Emergency Assistance Workshop. The purpose of this call is to address stakeholder comments received on the related workshops held on February 23rd and discuss a proposed framework put forth by joint commenters. This is Christina Osborne representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs team. I'll be facilitating the call. We have Danny Johnson, who is the policy lead for this initiative. He will be presenting on behalf of the ISO, and Lindsay Schleckaway from NV Energy will be presenting on behalf of the joint commenters and NVE. And then there are several other ISO representatives involved in this initiative who have joined as panelists, and they're listed on the top right of your screen. The presentation was posted yesterday on the initiative webpage. We are recording this call and will post the video file at that same location. The recordings and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will pause for questions throughout, and I'll instruct you on how to raise your hand at that time. Once the event producer has opened your phone line, please remember to introduce yourself by name and affiliation. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to Danny Johnson.
Thank you, Christina. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure to work with before, my name is Danny Johnson. I'm a member of the Market Infrastructure Policy team here at the ISO. Today we're looking to continue a discussion that we started a few weeks ago. That discussion was attempting to look at what additional policy enhancements that we could design and have in place going into the summer of 2022 operating season. It really focused on the concept of designing an emergency backstop within the RSE, as well as the potential to leverage the WEIM for emergency energy assistance. In this workshop, the CAISO will be facilitating. NVE, on behalf of the joint commenters, will be walking us through the proposal that they made to the CAISO in the comments that we received. I think the CAISO would then look to flesh out some additional details which we think we would need to implement any proposal, as well as to try to raise some of the themes that we heard and took away from the comments that the ISO received in the most recent round. So can we move to the next slide, Christina? So again, the previous workshop was actually a month ago today, on the 23rd of February. The CAISO did receive comments on those two topics I identified, the emergency RSE backstop, as well as the Weim emergency assistance. For the emergency backstop, the comments really offered varying opinions on both the necessity and any potential trigger that would represent an emergency backstop. We didn't see consensus on the need for a backstop provision from the commenters, which is something that we would look for to try to implement something in a very quick time frame prior to the summer. For the entities who supported this policy aspect, we didn't even see consensus on what is the appropriate threshold or trigger when a backstop would operate that would auto-fill the RSE. There didn't seem to be consensus between the NERC EEA2 or EEA3, even if there was a consensus to try to move away from specifically identified operator actions into, I guess, more of a NERC signifier. Given this, the CAISO plans to defer additional consideration on this issue to the second phase of the policy development. So to the extent that this is an aspect of the policy that stakeholders still feel should be in place going forward, this will provide the opportunity to try to drive towards consensus and see if there's a trigger that everybody can agree on that represents resource insufficiency. Can we go to the next slide? So the second topic we received comments on was the concept of utilizing the WEIM for emergency energy assistance. The CAISO agrees with the stakeholder comments and is looking to immediately begin exploring a framework where this can take place. This is a slight acceleration of what we were trying to accomplish in phase 2 of the policy development. The way I would look at this is we're just starting phase 2 right now. To the extent that we can have an interim design that we can get in place for summer of 2022, we will look to do that. Absent that, we will take away the feedback we receive from this process, and that will inform the policy development for phase 2. We did receive a proposed framework from the joint commenters that Lindsay will be walking through, I think starting on the next slide. We also had a framework put forward by PowerX. Their proposal looked to zero out net EIM imports once the RSE was failed, and then price additional transfers at the bid cap. I understand the the reasons why this is appealing, because it would serve to prevent economic leaning or help to prevent it. However, we think that this proposal is unworkable until the interaction between how CAISO clears exports out of the HAS process, potentially based on advisory EIM transfers, is addressed. The initial data that we saw that Guillermo's team put forward from last July indicates that that could be a potential driver of at least the ISO maybe failing the RSC inappropriately, so we would want to resolve that before we would price all transfers once an entity has failed at the bid cap. I would also point out that reducing transfers to zero is a significant deviation from the existing practice. Right now, transfers are just frozen. This creates kind of this is a well-understood paradigm that everybody's operating under. To the extent that there's optionality on a profile like this, an entity could have their transfers reduced from some high level to a much lower level. And again, this is something that I think in phase 2 is open, but at least for putting something in place in the summer of 2022 is not something that we think is feasible. With the rest of the comments that we received, stakeholders did generally support this concept. We did see concerns raised about this being a fundamental paradigm shift of the WEIM design. I think the idea behind the EIM originally was simply it was to facilitate economic displacement through an energy imbalance market. This is now expanding the scope into providing emergency assistance through that same platform. We did see a lot of concerns about the potential to spread reliability issues if the rules aren't set right on this. There were concerns raised regarding the impacts to pricing, and there was also a number of concerns raised regarding unforeseen issues due to what essentially would be a truncated stakeholder process to get something in place by the summer of 2022. I think that this is something that we take to heart. If we are able to get something in place, it would have to be fairly simple and straightforward to make all entities comfortable that the unforeseen issues would be limited, and we'd also have to have fairly widespread support to move forward with it on that timeline. I do see a couple questions in the queue. Christina, can we go to those questions?
Yeah, and just a reminder to folks, if you do have a question and you logged in the WebEx, you'll select the hand symbol above the chat window. If you just dialed in, you'll want to press #2 on your phone. So let's go ahead and go to Mohan. And just a reminder to please also identify the affiliation you're with. Thank you.
Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Mohan, we're not able to hear you. You might be muted on your end.
Oh, actually, sorry, I pressed button correct. I didn't have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Mark Harmon, please, or Holman, excuse me.
Hi there, can you hear me?
You're unmuted.
Hi, Mark, we can, go ahead.
Oh, perfect. Good morning. It's Mark Holman with PowerX. Thanks for the discussion so far. I just wanted to clarify a few of the elements on the page with PowerX's proposal and the way it was described, just for better clarity. I think the way we describe this is we're talking about a capacity failure, that the transfers should be set to zero. Any imports, when there's a true capacity failure, is in effect leaning on capacity. I think that's a different consequence than what's appropriate for a flex up failure, where freezing at the current level prevents leaning on flexibility by being able to increase those imports. Having said that, I think we're very open to, we don't want to see transfers go to zero, even in a capacity failure, immediately, especially for a false positive. So it could be something where the imports transition to zero over an hour, or there's some exception on non-critical hours. I think we want it to be reasonable and workable. I think, though, the challenge is that you don't want to see an entity who has big EIM imports have a 5 or 6 hour consecutive capacity failure and be able to sustain those imports. And we've certainly seen that experience with the CAISO VA, simply from the practical reality that the CAISO may have imports earlier in the day hour ending 12, hour ending 1, those can be substantial. And then if there's a capacity failure that goes on hour after hour, being able to maintain those imports at a high level really is capacity leaning. And then other entities that fail, if they don't happen to have imports, they can be limited at 0. And so that's the idea of going to 0, but very open to discussions on how do you make that workable. Maybe it's a transition over an hour. Maybe it comes down in the first hour and then goes to 0 for the second hour failure. Many options there. The second thing I just wanted to clarify is that we agree that there are challenges with the CAISO awarding non-EIM exports that are supported by EIM imports, even if they're advisory, that is what the software is doing, especially when those exports are effectively committed and often tagged as firm exports. It's a gap that we feel needs to be addressed. We support investigating that. I don't think it exists with other EIM entities. Other EIM entities don't have exports that they make outside of the EIM where they would be relying on capacity or flexibility from the EIM to support those exports. So this is a gap, I think, related to how the policy and the software has developed that should be looked into and addressed. I hope that provides some additional clarity on our perspective.
Mark, I think that's really helpful. I think what I heard, if I understood correctly, is your idea is more to ensure that there's more of a progressive type of penalty to not allow systemic multi-hour leaning. And I would agree that's something that we want to design. I guess my initial thoughts are that that's probably what we will tackle in phase 2 proper, rather than trying to see what we can get in place for this upcoming summer operating season. So I think that this is something that we can raise there about how we would best want to do that. So
yeah,
thank you.
I think you said it fairly similar to what I said. I don't think it's so much about progressive. It's just we don't want it to go to 0 as a sudden shock that could cause some challenges or with false positives. And so we recognize that we believe that going to 0, if there's a true capacity failure, is the right and equitable level, but that we need to recognize that there may need to be a transition period, perhaps across an hour, to make it more workable. And I think we've suggested that.
Yeah. And then I think the other benefit, at least to me, of having this discussion more in phase 2 would be it will allow the ISO to try to unwind that past export clearing based on the off advisory EIM transfers issue, which, at least from the CAISO BAA perspective, I think could eliminate a lot of the false positives that CAISO BAA members may have been concerned about under this type of design.
Thanks for the comments.
Yep. Thank you, Mark.
All right, Danny, I don't see anybody else in the queue, and just to let you know, you can exit the queue by selecting the hand icon again.
Okay, well, with that, Christina, then I will turn it over to Lindsay to brief us and kind of walk us in this workshop through the proposal that they're kind of putting forward on behalf of the joint commenters. Lindsay, the mic's yours.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Hi, I'm Lindsay Schleckway from NV Energy. First, I just wanted to state that these first 2 slides is a high-level proposal that we came up with the joint commenters. And then later I will be going over a pricing proposal that was developed just from NV Energy, just so there's no confusion there. So first, for this high-level proposal we're thinking of, we're thinking that the market runs as it does today. The solution would result in no change to LMPs for EIM entities that pass the resource efficiency test. And then we were thinking there would be an optional tool that could be elected by BA operators to prevent or cure emergencies. And I wanted to note here that we've been thinking that this option would be elected in real time or as close to real time as feasibly possible. For instance, we were thinking this would be elected during the resource sufficiency test run, or preferably within the hour, if at all possible. And then we were thinking that there would be an hourly test to determine there is enough market availability to allow the option to receive additional supply if needed. And the imbalance needs of the EIM entities that pass the resource efficiency test should have the priority access to the voluntarily offered supply, and the solution should not be designed, or should be designed to prevent any cascading reliability issues. And we think that that is very important. Next slide. Okay. So the scarcity price for the deficient EIM entity that elected to receive additional imports would be at, what we're proposing here is $2,000 per megawatt hour for those imports. So for that residual emergency energy service. So if the option is elected, then the imports would be procured at that $2,000 for any additional megawatt amount above the previous interval import amount, so above your capped amount. And then if the option is not elected, then the imports would continue to be capped at the previous market interval or the base transfer schedule. And then we were thinking the product would be settled out of the market to provide payments to generators that responded. And our expectation is that any use of this residual energy, emergency energy service would be infrequent. And for the time being, we've kind of proposed that the DMM should report on the use of this tool by reporting the EIM entity that triggered the transfers, the amount of additional energy and that was supplied, and then the number of hours in which the supply flowed. And that's all I had for this part of the proposal. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we'll see if anybody has any questions. So again, you can select the hand icon above the chat window, or if you just dialed in, press pound 2. And it looks like Callie Wells is in the queue.
Hi, Lindsay. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Thank you for putting together this presentation. I was just curious if you could, if there was any thought as to how you came up with the $2,000 price, because I know that the bid cap in certain situations today in the CAISO. I was just curious, is that where the 2,000 came from, or are you guys wanting a little bit more of a scarcity price signal above the typical $1,000 cap?
Yeah, so this was just something that we were thinking that we needed a price that would be sufficiently high to prevent leaning on the tool. So we just kind of picked that $2,000 amount just because that's the hard cap right now. But we were thinking it needed to be a true scarcity price, something that was sufficiently high just to prevent leaning. So that's kind of what we've proposed here, but kind of open to other thoughts on that.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I was just curious as to, I guess, the reasoning behind 2,000. So that makes sense. That makes sense.
All right, we'll go to Kathleen.
No, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, and thanks to Lindsay for going through this, and thanks for Callie. Callie kind of teed up what I was going to mention. I'm very aligned with the principle that you're articulating, Lindsay. I would make a suggestion that as a refinement, we spend some more time thinking about this value and whether it really should be a hard value of 2,000 or if it should be tuned to move along with the cap and the penalty prices as they in the CAISO's market as they function today. So, like, for example, if the penalty prices are all tuned around, let's say, the highest cost verified bid $1,500 per megawatt hour, the penalty prices are all tuned around that, especially in the pricing run. And I just have some concerns about price formation and what the incentives are. If it's a hard value that's above that, I'm still thinking through it. I just wanted to add that this is one of the things that I think needs a little bit of a deeper thought. Does that make sense?
Yes. Hi, Kathleen. Yes, that does make sense. And we've been thinking about that too. We were also kind of thinking maybe it could be it start off at 2,000, but when the cap rises to maybe 2,000 to the hard cap level due to those verified bids, then maybe it would need to also double. And so we've been thinking about that, but I haven't run that by any of the other joint commenters. So that's another potential idea. I don't know. what you think about that.
It's something I'll take back and start thinking about, but it's helpful for me. That was a helpful answer to clarify for me that you're thinking of the 2,000 on this slide as a doubling of the $1,000 cap, and if the cap were to increase based on the 831 kind of movements, that it would maybe keep that same ratio as it increased. And that's something I'll take back and think about further. Thanks, Lindsay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. We'll go to Mark.
Hi, Mark Holman with PowerX. I think this has several of the concepts and elements that we support, including in our proposal. Just a few comments to think about for everyone. One is that, well, I think that the payment to generators, who gets the money if someone was to be separated and have an import constraint at 2,000 under our proposal, I think does have to be a structure that there is perhaps out of market. But we do think, certainly as we move forward, whether that's implementable this summer or not, that in the BA that fails, that has to translate to market clearing prices. It doesn't mean that the market clearing prices immediately go to 2,000. If a BA fails and they have internal resources that they can deploy, but it needs to rise to that and perhaps be a penalty price that releases the import constraint at 2,000. Just thinking about the context, when you don't have a common resource adequacy framework, you need strong price signals if we're going to allow transfers to incent that forward procurement, because it'll often be cheaper to just pay the price for a handful of hours a year than it will be to build new resources or contract for new resources, and that can really undermine everyone being resource efficient in the first place and undermine reliability. So we do think that price signal needs to be strong, and that it needs to pass through to market prices in the deficient BA and be passed through to the customers responsible for procurement, for example, the entities with negative imbalances. So we think that is important as part of the solution that ultimately gets implemented. We look at other markets where you don't have an RA, you look at ERCOT, and we're not proposing that type of pricing, but you just look at the level of pricing you need to incent resource adequacy, so to speak, when you don't have a common RA framework and commitment.
Thanks, Mark. So I will be going through an NV Energy pricing proposal a little bit later, and we're trying to develop something with some of those concepts that you mentioned. So we are trying to create some strong price signals. So I'll be interested on your thoughts when we get to that.
Appreciate it.
Mark, let's go to John next.
Make sure your device is not set on mute.
John, we're not able to hear you. Just make sure you're unmuted.
Can you guys hear me now?
There we go. Yes, thank you.
All right, sorry about that. This is John Diff from Southern California Edison. I have a question regarding your last bullet, not the sub-bullet, but the last bullet. So it lists here the expectation is that any use of the RES would be infrequent. My question is, let's just say there are BAs that are abusing this. Have you put in any thought on what the repercussions are for the abuse, and to basically incentivize disincentivize people from abusing this option, and kind of to promote balancing authorities to actually procure capacity so that they wouldn't use this option frequent.
Yes. Hi, John. So we have tried to think about this a bit. kind of what we were thinking is that we need to create something that has very strong price signals, like Mark was stating, so that it's not something that entities would want to elect, because if we failed the resource efficiency test and, you know, it was just a miscalculation in the test, or it was a very low failure, this is not something that you would want to use that tool for. You would really, we want the prices to be high enough to really only be used for emergency issues. And so we're trying to develop the price to kind of cure for that, but then also for the time being for this, since we would like this to be implemented relatively quickly, we were thinking that the DMM could monitor this as kind of another measure, just so that we at least see what's going on. And then we definitely think this is something that needs to be revisited, though. And maybe we do, if there are repeat offenders that are constantly utilizing this, then maybe we do need to go back and look at all of this and maybe put in some additional escalating penalties.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I feel like there are some concerns with this. If there aren't any penalties for repeat offenders, given that sometimes it is more convenient to just take that hit and take the $2,000 per megawatt hour price, rather than, you know, going out and signing contracts with other generators to meet your capacity needs. So, you know, sometimes even that is actually more expensive than just going out to the market and at a $2,000 price threshold. So, you know, something to consider for, you know, preventing these abuses from happening.
Okay, yeah, we'll consider, thank you for these comments. We'll consider that some more and kind of think of ways to get around that or prevent it. Thank you.
John, while you're still on this is Danny with the ISO. I'm curious, do you have any feel of what would represent, I guess, abusing this or too frequent use of this type of framework? Because that's at least when I thought about this, I've kind of struggled with is what is too frequent use? Is it 1 hour in the summer? Is it 10 hours? Is it 1 hour in a week? Like, do you have any feel for what you would envision too frequent use would be?
We lose John. It looks like you're muted.
Sorry, can you guys hear me? Yeah. So, yeah, I don't really have a threshold on what is considered abuse. I was just wondering if you know, something can be proposed, and then we can all you know, pick at it to see what makes sense. But knowing that you know, California does have a resource adequacy program, and not familiar with other balancing authorities, kind of want to ensure that everyone who does comes to the EIM does have enough capacity and doesn't utilize this market in an ineffective way. So.
Thanks, John. I think we share that concern, and I think everybody on this call does. So I think this would be an element that we'll look to highlight in the comments that we ask, or the questions we ask for comment on, is what does the community think represents an abuse of this type of framework.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. And that was our last question. So Danny, we'll go back to you.
Hey, Christina, this is Brad Cooper. I put up my hand. Hey,
sorry,
I just wanted to add that this is a good discussion. It seems to me like the concept we're trying to capture is not using it too frequently, because if this is to prevent leaning. Leaning to me is a BA that doesn't have sufficient capacity and uses the EIM rather than build sufficient capacity or line up sufficient capacity. So if I'm doing that, I would fail, or if I'm in that situation, I would fail the RSE just a few times, just at the peak loads, and and that's still, the argument then is, even paying a $2,000 penalty is probably a lot less than building, for example, a new peaker plant. So maybe the metric people are trying to get at is, evidence that the use of the RSE is for emergencies. And, it seems to me that's more like situations where the BAA had an outage that wasn't accounted for, that was beyond planning metrics or unusually high load or something, or, maybe that's what we're trying to say. So I just wanted to bring up that perspective, that I don't think failing frequently would necessarily be the metric, because it seems like people could use this infrequently and still use that as an alternative to buying to building capacity, and that leads to a further thought, because even $2,000 is probably a lot cheaper than building capacity. As Mark Holman brought up, other ISOs that don't have capacity markets, and as the gentleman from SCE brought up, we have a RA paradigm that, where we have separate capacity payments. Maybe what we mean by the $2,000 is maybe that it's not intended to provide a deterrence, but it's intended as quote unquote fair compensation to the supplier, or at least something better than the status quo than necessarily providing a deterrent. So I just wanted to bring up those points for people to think about.
Any questions or response to Brad's comments? Give it a moment. Okay, I'm not seeing any. And as Danny mentioned, we are going to be asking for, you'll have an opportunity to submit written comments on what we've been discussing today. We're going to ask for those April 1st. So there will be an opportunity to submit written comments. So Danny, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you, Lindsay. So I think trying to do a little bit deeper dive on this proposal and take some input that we received in the last round of comments, one of the things that really struck a chord with the CAISO is that any emergency assistance must ensure that capacity insufficiency is not spread. I think this proposal looked at testing the residual supply within the WEIM. I think that without accounting for the available transmission to deliver that supply to the deficient BAA, I think this potential does exist. One framework which we've started to think through is to test the neighboring BAAs to the deficient EIM BAA for their residual capacity, as well as the residual transmission that is available still to deliver that excess capacity. I have a couple examples on the next couple slides about how this could work, and at least how we're thinking about this, that I'll be walking through. But before I get there, the one other thing I wanted to raise, which kind of gets back to what Brad just talked about, and I think some of the concerns that Mark with PowerX raised, is should a WEIM entity be able to elect for their capacity to be used for WEIM emergency assistance? I think the current construct of EIM is that energy is made available for mutually beneficial economic displacement. I think that shifting it for that energy being available for emergency conditions does raise what seems to be a legitimate concern about potentially creating different incentives in forward procurement. So I think this is something that we would, again, look for comment on, but it's something that we wanted to raise in this venue. Can we go to the next slide, Christina? Oh, no, I see Mark has a question. Can we go back?
Hold on. There we go. So we'll go to Mark Holman. Yossi?
Here. First, hi, it's Mark Holman with PowerX. First, I just want to say I agreed with pretty much everything Brad said. I think maybe except for the last point, I think there is an appropriate compensation component, but I think it is more about discouraging, or maybe said a better way, incenting entities to build and contract. At the end of the day, if you don't have either a robust RA program that everyone's part of, or sufficient pricing incentives that really do drive that forward procurement and build, then it's reliability that suffers. You know, what we don't want to see happen is entities thinking that a cheaper solution is to use the EIM for capacity, that it's lower costs, multiple entities pursue that, and we all get caught and we have a reliability event. And so I think it's really about protecting reliability at the end of the day and making sure we don't perpetuate a market that enables leaning as a lower cost option to contracting for real supply or building your own real supply. I think, Danny, I appreciate these slides. I was just going to say on your comment there about shifting the EIM and its purpose, I just think we need to be really careful here about making assumptions about what other entities have and can make available. I'm glad you're bringing in the transmission piece, and I'm not trying to discourage finding solutions here, including interim solutions, but entities available balancing capacity or other things they have in their VA, they may need that for specific purposes. They're trying to protect their own reliability as a standalone VA beyond the EIM. Some of those resources can be energy limited, and if you deplete them in a couple hours, you put them in the jam later. And then even if we don't do that, if we were to take all of the EIM supply and bail someone out, in some ways we're bringing the rest of the EIM to the edge. And so we just got to be careful that we want to protect people's reliability to the extent we can, including when they're in an emergency, but there's got to be a line there of not increasing the reliability risk of others to do that. And that goes beyond the purpose of the EIM, in our view.
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, I completely agree that any design that we would look to implement would try to ensure that reliability issues are not cascaded between BAAs who participate. So Christina, do you want to go to the next slide?
My computer's a little slow, Dan, sorry. There you go.
Oh, okay. All right, so I have two examples here. The blue BAAs are resource sufficient BAAs who are long. The kind of tannish BAA, BA2, is 200 megawatts short. The megawatt values you see in between the different BAAs are residual transmission that is available. So this is open to be scheduled if the incremental transfers aren't locked. So this is how it would work if there's sufficient transmission and sufficient excess capacity. So the BA2 is deficient. It's connected with 1 and 3. So you would look to form a zone of the 3 BAAs. The first test would be to see if that zone is net long. So that the zone, if you add up all 3 bid and capacity and all 3 demand, would be 100 megawatts long. In this example, BAA1 has 200 additional megawatts. They have 50 megawatts of transfer capacity to BA2, so they would be able to provide 50 megawatts of additional supply directly to BA2. BA3 has 100 megawatts of additional capacity. They have 200 megawatts of transfer to BA2, but they would only be able to provide 100 megawatts of assistance since that's all their excess supply is. BAA 1 and 3 and the residual 100 megawatts between those 2 BAAs would then allow for BAA 1 to wheel some of their excess capacity through BAA 3 to BAA 2 to cure the insufficiency. This is a fairly straightforward example, but this is kind of the happy path solution. Can we go to the next example, Christina? So this is where, or I've changed the numbers a little bit, but this is where not testing for transmission and there being insufficient transmission either directly connected or through the parallel to BAA2 BAAs could create an issue. So if you run that same test and just say, is the zone around BA2 resource sufficient? The answer is yes. It's 25 megawatts long. In this example, BA1 is only able to offer 25 megawatts of additional capacity to BA2. BA3 has 100 megawatts of additional capacity, but only 25 megawatts of transfer, so they can offer 25 megawatts of additional assistance to BA2. effectively, what would occur if we don't test and try to limit what the transfers are based on the underlying transmission is, in this example, a subzone is created between BAA 1 and 2, where you have 2,000 megawatts of generation, you have 2175 megawatts of load, you can get 50 megawatts, or you can get 25 megawatts of assistance from BAA 3, but effectively you create a zone that is 150 megawatts resource insufficient. The reliability problem and the insufficiency from BAA 2 then becomes BAA 1's problem. So this would be one of the things that we would look to avoid in whatever framework we're able to come up to implement an emergency assistance. But hopefully this illustrates that testing for the transmission both directly connected as well as the transmission between the neighboring BAAs is something that we would have to look to do to make sure that there aren't reliability issues that are created. I see a question in the queue from Libby.
Yeah, we'll go to Libby's line.
Danny, I might need you to walk me through that again. I'm not sure.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you just say it all again, and I'll see if I can figure out what my question is? I'm just a little confused. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
This is Libby Kirby from BPA. My bad.
Thanks.
All right. So, yeah, my apologies if I ran through that a little too quickly. The idea here is that testing just for capacity sufficiency in the WEIM or even in the neighboring BAAs may not be sufficient to ensure reliability. In this case, you could form a zone with the direct neighbors of deficient BAA2. So this would be BAA 1, 2, and 3. If you tested for capacity sufficiency, you'd actually see that that zone is 25 megawatts long. So unless you start testing for transmission, you could create constrained subzones with BAA2. So in this example, BAA1 has quite a bit of residual transmission to BAA2, but they have fairly limited excess capacity, so they're able to provide 25 megawatts of supply. BAA3 has 100 additional megawatts of capacity, but only 25 megawatts of transfer to BAA2. BAA1 and 3 in this example don't have any transmission capacity available between them. If we don't test for both the direct transfers as well as the ability to wheel through some of this transmission or to wheel through the neighboring BAAs, the concern is that BAA3 is able to offer 25 megawatts of assistance to BAA2, but BAA1 and 2 now have 100 or have a 200 megawatt open transfer between them and have 150 more megawatts of demand than they have supply able to meet that demand. So now BAA2's issue where they were 200 megawatts short became a BAA1 and 2 issue where the two BAAs in their subzone are 150 megawatts short. And the market would optimally schedule what it would schedule. Right now, this type of interaction is explicitly prevented because we would just simply lock the transfers on BAA2. When you start to unlock the transfers into BAA2, this is the type of situation we would look to avoid. Does that help, Libby?
I'm closer now. I'm still a little confused what problem that poses to BAA1 in the sense that it looks like either way, BAA2 is the one that's going to be short. You're going to use that 25 for BAA from BAA1 to BAA2 if you don't freeze the transfers. But from what I remember, and maybe the answer to this is the only way to effectively meet the proposals that NV proposed is to include the transmission. But I would think that if BAA1 then needs that 25 megawatts again, it's going to go back, like you're going to just stop transferring it to BAA2.
I guess.
So I'm not understanding what the further issue is for BAA1.
Is that the market's not going to have any mechanism to not transfer that. It's going to see a zone, and the prices are going to rise in that zone because there is now insufficient supply to meet that
okay,
zonal,
I think
demand.
That's the piece that I'm missing is that it's not that it's an issue for BAA1 to get the megawatts, it's that without some sort of inserting ourselves into that optimization, the price in the whole zone is going to rise. I think that's the issue we're saying. that BA1 is financially impacted by just unlocking the transfers if we wanted to.
Yeah.
Oh, 100% agreed. I think reliability is a question no matter what, right? Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully that helps.
I think I'm following more. Thank you.
Great. We'll go to Dustin.
Hi, this is Dustin Harris.
Hi, Dustin. Are you there?
Portland. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to second Danny's comment there. My understanding is today there's a mechanism in the EIM that basically blocks the EIM from exporting from a BA that is insufficient or infeasible. In other words, per the example that was given, if BA number 1 is infeasible, then it can't export to BA2. Therefore, per Danny's comment, it would block that infeasibility from transferring over to BA1. Is that not accurate, or is this considering getting rid of that blocking mechanism?
So this is, I think it's like T delta T greater than 0 constraint that it won't let you export if the PBC starts to be relaxed.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, I think I'm aware of the constraint that you're referencing. I think the issue is knowing exactly when the PBC is going to be relaxed between the two BAAs might not be a bright line. Because to the extent that there's an open transfer and there is load in BA2 that's modeled closer than close to the generators in BA1, and it has a shorter impedance path, I don't know if the solution is naturally going to relax the PBC in BA1 first. Would be my opinion.
I apologize. I've had some phone issues. I was requested to identify where I'm from. I'm from Portland General Electric. This is Dustin Herrick. So I think that is key. And if that mechanism isn't working properly, then it would be necessary to ensure that it is as part of this to make sure that even though that transmission constraint is getting relaxed, whereas today it would be blocked, we would maintain the requirement that you can't force an infeasible BA to export to another BA. That would be necessary.
Yeah, and that constraint is in place simply with the network model and the open transmission between the two BAAs. It would be a optimal market solution where that PBC would be relaxed. So just depending upon where the network model is, it could partially be relaxed, I think, in BAA1. At which point the exports would be cut off, but at that point, some additional export would have occurred. Does that help, Dustin?
Yeah, I'm just commenting that needs to be addressed because I can't imagine we would support a proposal where insufficient BA would literally drive other BAs infeasible.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I don't see any other questions, Danny.
Okay. So I guess trying to work through how we could try to test and prevent this situation from occurring, there are a couple different ways. This first one is a more robust solution. It builds on the proposal that Lindsay put forward first, and that it's the failed entity would elect to receive additional transfers. You would then have to test the neighboring BAAs to ensure they're net long. Then there would need to be some type of transmission test. In this more robust solution, it would test both the directly connected transmission to the insufficient BAA as well as the ability to wheel through network transmission between neighboring BAAs to serve the insufficient BAAs. The incremental transfer limit would then be raised corresponding to that calculated value. I see a question from Libby.
Might be from before. Libby, do you have another question?
Yeah, sorry, this is another question. So I'm just trying to translate the words into that previous example. So the previous example, in your robust solution, basically that 200 megawatts would be limited to 25. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yep. Yeah. So the net transfer limit of BA2 would go up by 50 megawatts in this case.
Yes. Okay. So they get the 50 megawatts, 25 from BA3 and 25 from BA1, but that 200 megawatt transferability would be limited to 25, such that BA2 gets the 50, which is good. It helps from a reliability standpoint, but it doesn't cause price increases in BAA1. Or the potential to steal megawatts, which is not the way I should say that, but to start solving for megawatts that BA1 actually needs.
Optimally scheduling megawatts that BA1 might need.
Love it.
Or that might be part of their capacity stack.
Yeah.
Thank you, Libby. Sorry about that. All right. Go ahead, Danny.
That solution, testing for that network transfer capability, given how well networked some EIM BAs are, is something that is definitely feasible. It does add complexity, which in turn adds implementation time, which somewhat cuts against one of the objectives here, which is to see is there a design that we could get in place in the more near term. This is a simpler solution that looks really similar. The big difference here is for bullet 3, rather than testing for that network transmission capability, you would simply limit the directly connected, you would limit what BA2 can import to the min of the directly connected transfer capability or residual capacity in each neighboring BAA. So I think applying this example or this framework to the previous examples, can we go back to the first example? I think it was slide 6. Here, I guess with those two different frameworks, for the simplest solution in this, BA2 is 200 megawatts insufficient, but BAA1 could get 50 from, or BA2 could get 50 from BA1 and could get 100 from BA3. So they'd get 150 megawatts if you don't test for this network transmission or network transfer capability. If you do, then the full insufficiency could be cured, but again, that does add solution complexity or implementation complexity. So next slide. I want to be clear, I think both of these potential frameworks would necessitate some software enhancements. We would have to test for this underlying transmission. I would like everybody to consider in their comments and our goal of both an interim near-term solution to have in place for the summer of 2022 and the long-term solution. What's the appropriate balance on how complex we would like this to be? I have a bullet here that really tries to highlight that the amount of additional transfer capacity, especially in very well-networked EIM entities, could be inversely related to the implementation complexity. Because those examples are fairly straightforward. They're a BA equivalent of a 3-bus system. As you get into more well-networked systems, the complexity does increase. I see a question in the queue from Kathleen and another one from Libby.
Let's go to Kathleen.
Again, no, thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So I'm trying to work my brain through your examples, Danny, but there's one thing that is confusing me, and I wanted to ask the question and see if you could help me clarify. I see the words on the slide, testing for underlying transmission capacity, but the way that I understood your example was not that there's a limit, not that there is insufficient transfer capability, but that the transfer capability may be larger than the overall net long position in the zone, such that the market could re-optimize and optimally schedule from the other BAA and kind of flip the shortage around the zone. And so that's what has me confused. Is I'm not seeing, I actually see it as having the transfer capability, but not having the capacity in other areas to make up that shortfall. And can you help point out what I'm missing?
Can we go back a couple slides, Christina? So you're framing this as we would want to ensure that there's enough capacity to back, or can you say that one more time, Kathleen?
Yes, the way I see this example, let's do BA1 to BA2. There's sufficient transfer capability. There's not sufficient capacity, let's say excess capacity, so surplus in the zone to support the transfer capability of 200. There's only 25 megawatts of surplus to back that without creating a ripple effect that we're trying to figure out how to avoid, right? It was confusing me because it's 200. I see 225 megawatts of transfer capability in. What I'm not seeing is the surplus to back it.
Okay, so I think the way we initially thought of this is you'd create a zone with BAA2 with the directly connected neighbors. So if you tested their directly connected neighbors, which would be BAA1 and 3, you'd see 225 megawatts of additional residual capacity. And you'd actually see 225 megawatts of directly connected transfer capability to BAA2.
Yeah, but I'm only seeing but I'm only seeing 50 megawatts of the lower of capacity or transfer capability, and that's how we're getting to the 50. I think the framing of it as identifying that there's sufficient transmission, it's maybe too simple of a framing for me as I'm trying to process this example. It seems like it's a combination of both transfer capability from the neighboring areas that can be backed by surplus without causing a ripple effect. Is that a decent understanding?
I think that's a fair way to say. I think what we're just trying to highlight here is that testing for residual capacity is probably too simple of an approach, and what you're highlighting is testing for residual transmission is too simple of an approach, and really you'd have to test for both. You basically have to test for what is the deliverability of the residual capacity in the neighboring BAA.
That is how I would think of it.
So I would agree with you.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good framing.
Okay, we'll go to Libby.
This is Libby from BPA again. Just want to make sure, so in the simple solution, nothing changes in the second example, right? They still get the 50. The difference is in that first example, the maximum they could get is 150, is that right? 50 from BA1 and 100 from BA2. They don't get the full 200. But either way, we're closer in that example than if we totally block them.
Yep. Yeah, it helps partially cure the insufficiency.
Okay, and I would say just to the last comment, I think where we on number 4 in both where it just says allow incremental transfers corresponding to the calculated value. It's basically, I think we're saying the calculated value is the minimum of the excess capacity and the excess transmission to that BA.
Yeah.
And then the difference between simple and robust is just whether or not you take into account wheeling.
Yeah, the network transfer capability between the neighboring BAAs.
Great, thank you.
All right, Dustin, did you have a question? Looks like you dropped out of the queue. And Kathleen, I still see you in the queue. Do you have a follow-up? Oh, okay, she just fell out as well. Okay.
Okay, so I think we can go forward one slide even. This would be, I guess, different implementation mechanisms that I wanted to throw out there for how we could allow additional transfers. Again, right now the transfers are limited to the value on which the RSU was last passed. I think that value could be increased by the results of the residual capacity and transmission tests that we would need to develop that we just walked through. Alternatively, I guess the BAA's load could be biased down to reflect that insufficient amount. So in those examples, you wouldn't create those constrained zones or potentially ripple the price or reliability effect if the load in the deficient BAA, the market wasn't trying to clear as high of a load. Both of these concepts rely on administrative pricing to account for the incremental transfers. We've heard a concern raised, which I think is valid, is that simply clearing more supply within the entire network will clear higher up on the total bid stack. A lot of these issues can be avoided through the implementation of a hurdle rate. This is something that we put forward all the way back in the straw proposal or the issue paper for the RSC back in last June. However, the downside here is this probably, again, is more software enhancements and integration and implementation work, which presents a barrier to have something in the near term. Next slide. The other issue I'd want to raise before turning it back over to Lindsay is what is the appropriate way to distribute the revenue through an administrative penalty? An administrative penalty does mean that we would need to develop additional charge codes and that they would be implemented during summer operations, which I know is probably not ideal. For the actual revenue distribution, there is one thought would be you could do this pro rata to all Western EAM BAAs that pass the RSC. I think that the downside here is there's poor cost causation since not all entities are actually providing additional megawatts to cure the insufficiency. The flip side of this is you could try to do it to all entities who are net exporters. However, this doesn't provide additional revenue for entities whose costs are raised by clearing more supply. It also wouldn't compensate entities for reducing a net import position. I think effectively if they reduce their net import position, they could be construed as helping to cure the insufficient BAA. Again, this would be something that we could design and maybe it would be prorated to all entities who are net exporters or whose net import positions were reduced. But again, this simply adds additional complexity, and we're, at least for the interim solution, trying to avoid complexity. So as we ask for comments, please keep in mind what both your preferred long-term revenue allocation would look like from this type of emergency assistance, as well as what would be an acceptable allocation in the interim as we look to get something in place a little sooner than the full phase 2 policy development. Can we go to the next slide?
I think the next one is Lindsay's. Hold on a second.
Yep. Oh, I see one more. Actually, I think we should go back. I see a couple questions from Kathleen and Mark.
Okay. Yeah, let's go to Kathleen's line.
No, thank you. Kathleen Colbert, Vistra. This is a very practical question, but I've got my eye on one of the goals here being what can be done by summer 2022. So a question I have for the KISO, in case you don't know now, but it'd be helpful in the next kind of conversations to know is, I know setting up new settlement charge codes can be quite difficult and time consuming. Have you explored strictly from an implementation perspective whether settlement charge code would be more difficult to achieve this, let's say even July of 2022, but to achieve some time this summer versus having it be a market enhancement? And I am specifically thinking about different groups of folks who do that work and different lead times involved. So I was just wondering if you had thought through the implementation side.
Yeah, we've started to, Kathleen, and I think the feasibility of getting anything in place probably comes from limiting what we try to change on the market side. As everybody on this call should be aware, that the Siemens pipe at the KISO is fairly full right now with all the enhancements that we're working through with nodal FRP in the first phase of RSSE, at least on things I've been more associated with. So our thought was that the implementation through a new settlements charge code and administrative pricing would be more feasible. I've reached out to our settlements team. I don't think that this is something that they would sign up for, but I do think that it's at least worth discussing with them, because I think on the Siemens side, if we try to completely have a new market design to do this by next June, I don't think there's sufficient time to do that. For next June or even sometime into the summer.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the brass tacks as we focus on what may be doable in a very short time frame. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. We'll go to Mark.
Hi, good morning. It's actually Jeff Spires with PowerX this time. Danny, I just had a question to follow up with something you were saying on the previous slide. If we can go back to slide 12, please. I just wanted to further understand what you were saying with respect to the hurdle rate and the software enhancements required there. And the reason I'm asking is, today there's already an import constraint in the market for any VA that fails the RSE evaluation. And so it seems like already having the import constraint in place, the question would be, what would be the penalty price to relax that constraint and potentially allow more imports to occur that go beyond that limitation? And that seems to me to be pretty comparable to the concept of a hurdle rate. So can you just help me understand what the enhancements would be, or if maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by that? Because I'm just interpreting it to mean essentially relaxing that existing import limitation at some level that allows more imports.
Yeah, I think that we're talking about the same thing, Jeff, and I'm not sure what the implementation looks like to be able to relax that, or if that's a configurable parameter right now, or if that's a fixed parameter. To the extent that it's fixed and not configurable, that's a software enhancement. I also think on the hurdle rate, there may be more testing involved too, since the market's just not clearing under its current methodology, and it does increase the risk of unknown market results or unforeseen market results. But
okay, and I think oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think looking ahead at some of the slides, Lindsay's remaining presentation may come back to this, but it sounds like at least we're sort of on the same page of saying implementing a hurdle rate could be, at least in theory, achieved by you have an import constraint that already applies today, potentially relaxing that at some lower penalty price than it is in today, because presumably today it's essentially a hard cap on imports. But if you were to lower that penalty price to something below the power balance constraint, then conceivably you could get that outcome of relaxing that constraint and allowing transfers before hitting the power balance constraint relaxation.
Yeah, I think this is an approach that we would look to explore, and I think that this may be a preferable approach. It's just, I think it's, at least from the ISO's perspective, potentially more of an open question on how implementable is it near term. But okay. Again, if this is where the preferred approach is to implement something like this, I think we can examine it.
Okay. Thanks, Danny. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. All right, I don't see anybody else in the queue, so let's turn it back over to Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay Fleckway from NB Energy again. So I wanted to go over our pricing proposal. I'll first go through the goals and then our proposal, and then I have an example to kind of illustrate everything, so hopefully it all makes sense. And then I will, hopefully I can get through all that before I get to questions, because I think it'll make more sense in the example. So for our goals, we're thinking that the sales entity should exhaust internal generation before using any incremental transfers, and that we would have the ability to track the amount of incremental transfer and still have the ability to go to the power balance constraint slack when emergency transfer capacity is exhausted. So we still have the ability to relax that. And then we'd like to send a price signal that represents the shortage when using the incremental transfer. And we're trying to create a simple solution that will not affect regular operation. So next slide, please. Thank you. So for our proposal, we would like to create an emergency capacity ITC. This would be a new transfer that would be built into the model. We're thinking this would only be enforced when a BA opted in for emergency capacity and emergency transfer capacity was available. So like Danny stated earlier, if the capacity may be available or if there's a limitation in transfer availability, then this would also be limited to that. The transfer capacity would include full transfers up to the T.7.5 minute point, which is that current capping point, and then there would be that allowable emergency transfer capacity. The ITC transfer capability would be a two-step penalty price. There would be no cost to the T.7.5 point, the current capping point. So that occurs as it does today. As the transfers start to go up to that import limit, then the prices would remain the same. The emergency transfer capacity range would have the penalty price above ABC and below PBC in the scheduling run, while the pricing run would have the soft or hard cap depending on market conditions. And this is something I'll explain in the example. We are thinking that it would send price signal when dispatched into emergency capacity range and all other internal generation is exhausted. We're thinking that this emergency transfer capacity ITC would be a pre-process enforcement and does not interfere with normal operations and penalty price relaxation. So next slide, please. Okay. So here is our example. So in this example, we have 1,000 megawatt initial load, and then we have 50 megawatts of upward available balancing capacity, and we have 50 megawatts of emergency transfer capacity that's priced at $13.50 in the scheduling run. So that's the amount that is available in the market, that's surplus. For this example, it's a $1,000 soft cap, and the T minus 7.5 minutes transfer is capped at 10 megawatts import. So we'll go through each of these. So in a load range of 1,000 to 1,050, the ABC would be relaxed, dispatched in that load range. The transfer cap would go to up to 10 megawatts. And the emergency transfer wouldn't be dispatched during this time frame because we want to dispatch all of the ABC first. The PBC slack would not be relaxed yet. And then the scheduling run, this would occur at 1,050 to 1,200 in the scheduling run. That would be the price. And then in the pricing run, your LMPs would be based on your bid price for participating resources and for at the default energy bid for your non-participating resources. And then, so that's kind of how things occur today. We're not, that one, no changes are occurring. So then, let's say the load goes up to 1075, and it's within that load range of 1050 to 1100. There is still a transfer, you're still capped at that 10 megawatt import, but then to solve that 1075 load, you would have an additional 25 megawatts that would be dispatched for this emergency transfer. The market can still solve, so we don't need to relax the PBC slack, and the scheduling run would be priced at $13.50 for this. And then the pricing run, we would like the LMPs to be at $1,000. So for that pricing run, all of your load and everything, it's showing that you're receiving emergency transfer capacity. So it does seem sufficient to have all of your BA load and energy, everything to be, your LMP to be at that $1,000 range. Okay, and then let's say your load jumps up above 1,100 megawatts. So we have it at 1,101. Well, you would still receive the emergency transfer dispatch of, you would receive all of it. So the 50 megawatts, but it doesn't resolve your load. You still have a megawatt left, and you're still capped at that 10 megawatt import. So you have 60 megawatts total transfers coming in. The PDC would need to be relaxed in that case, and the scheduling run would be priced at $14.50, and then your prices would still be for the BA at $1,000. One important thing to note that's not on the slide is we're still proposing that the emergency transfer amount, that 25 or 50 megawatts that's shown here, that portion would be settled at a price higher than that $1,000 LMP in your BA. That would be at the $2,000 amount. That's what we're proposing there. So hopefully this makes sense, but please let me know if there are any questions.
Any questions for Lindsay? Again, you can select the hand icon above the chat or press pound. You just dialed in. All right, let's go to Libby's line.
Hi, Lindsay. This is Libby from BPA. I'm full of questions today. One question I have is this emergency capacity, is this based on like the example Danny was showing before where we're calculating based on that sort of transition check, the incremental capacity, or is this something we're having to submit?
No, yes. What we were thinking was this would be that emergency transfer amount that was available from Danny's example.
Okay, great. That makes perfect sense. That was what I was expecting. Just wanted to make sure. And then this actually brings up something that I haven't really thought about at all, but forgive me if this question doesn't quite make sense, but it kind of makes me think way back to the beginning of this, like, what is the difference between doing this like emergency transfer piece versus just letting it immediately hit the power balance constraint and testing, trying to get excess capacity with that running with the relaxed power balance constraint?
Well, okay, so if you had the relaxed, so if you pass the test, if you pass the resource sufficiency test, then you would still, as long as the market had additional capacity or supply, then it would send the energy to you at that price signal. But if you fail the resource sufficiency test, then you're capped at, in this example, the 10 megawatts of import. And so the only way to be able to even get additional energy would be to have something like this where there would be access to an emergency transfer in sort of this method that was kind of proposed.
I thought if you fail the RF test, don't you still, like, you'll go through your ABC and then you would still, like, the optimization would still start relaxing toward to fix the power balance constraint, even if you fail RF, right? Or am I wrong?
Oh, true. Yes, sorry. I must have misunderstood you there. Yes, the ABC would still be dispatched up to, so that occurs like it does today. We wanted to go ahead and put that in there, the sample, or our proposal, we're not proposing to change that.
Yeah, that makes sense. The piece I'm confused about is even if you fail RF, if you didn't have this emergency transfer capacity, the power balance constraint piece would still happen, right? So, and again, this is like way back to the beginning, just like this idea as a whole. I've lost track of what does it give us over going straight to the power balance constraint if you fail, which I think would happen anyway if you fail RF. Admittedly, I know there's like additional prices and things like that, but in terms of having to put this into the optimization, what does it do aside from what the power balance constraint relaxation would do anyway?
I may have to let Robert that. He's also, I think, in queue.
Okay, and I was going to say, I don't know if also maybe that's a Danny question. I'm not totally sure, but suddenly I've lost track of, I'm just not quite sure where the difference lies.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Lindsay. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, Yeah, I was just saying it's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. So I was hoping either Robert Fisher or Danny could answer that.
Danny, I'll let Robert take the first crack at this.
Okay.
I think.
Hi, this is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. Can you hear me?
Robert, yeah.
So you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I apologize. I'm at the airport in case there's a loud noise. But to answer your question, that 50 megawatt transfer is additional energy that wouldn't have been there before. So the slack would have kicked in the example when the additional transfer kicked in. So in the first example, you would take the slack is at 0. It would be increased to that 50 megawatts. So the idea is you're short prior to that additional transfer without this emergency energy. So this emergency transfer capability helps relieve some or hopefully all of the shortage that would occur. Does that help answer your question?
I guess what I'm confused about is that isn't the power balance constraint energy that it's pulling in already sort of emergency?
Nope. So the power balance slack is there. So it's basically a slack variable that's there to make sure that your power balance constraint is still feasible. But that slack is not real energy. It's showing you how much you're short of meeting your load.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Let's go to Kathleen.
Thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I want to thank Nevada again for putting this together. This is really interesting. A lot of your principles and concepts, I think, seem very sound as I'm processing them. The one thing I would note and request maybe a little further consideration on your part, if you don't mind, is it might be illustrative, but I just want to highlight one concept, which is the value that you would set in the scheduling run for the emergency transfer capacity. When I think about it from an economic perspective, the way I think about this is what is my opportunity cost of accessing emergency transfer capability in order, as Robert said, hopefully avoid needing to violate the PBC. From that perspective, I would think that we'd want to think about scheduling run price as, well, what's the opportunity cost? Anything just shy of violating PBC. So in my mind, I probably would have had a scenario of the value at $14.49. Keep thinking about it. I know we're not at that stage. I just wanted to note a couple economic principles to add to this as you think through it. What's the opportunity cost of avoiding violating slack? I would assume it's at $1 less, basically.
Hi, Kathleen. Thanks for that. Yeah, that was something I think that I asked Robert before about, and he said that there needed to be a larger difference, that the price would have been too close, and then you could have had instances where the PBC would actually be relaxed prior to the emergency transfer capacity. But I can also I think Robert's back on, so I can let him speak.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you for this question. Yes, in a perfect world, and that penalty price would be very close to where the power balance constraint slack is. With the error that occurs within penalty prices and overlap of penalties, you sometimes want to have a pad between those penalty prices. So the 1350 is just an example for this illustrative situation, but there would be some difference between those penalty prices. So if there were losses or, say, MIP error, it would go in the proper priority order.
No, that's incredibly helpful. I'd just like to recommend a design principle as we kind of work through this of minimizing that gap as much as possible so we send the best economic signal while respecting priorities. Thank you.
That number was just picked because it's above ABC and below PBC. So ISO penalty price team would probably pick something somewhere in that range, and this was just the highlighted example.
Thanks, Kathleen.
All right. Libby, did you have another question? I see your hand is still raised. Okay. All right, I don't see anybody else in the queue. Any final comments, Lindsay?
No, that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and turn it back over to Danny then.
Thanks, Christina. So this is one last slide I had, which would be additional considerations. The second one we just addressed are what are the assumptions that should be made regarding available balancing capacity. I think that in the example that Lindsay and Robert presented, like it's pretty clear where and what the expectation is with the ABC. I think ideally this would be used to cure resource insufficiency regardless. However, I think that we would want comment and see if everybody has that same understanding. The second thing that I thought I'd bring up is what are reasonable assumptions regarding excess supply that is shown to meet uncertainty. I think we've talked a lot about these tests in the concept of capacity failure. There's also the potential for a flexibility test failure where a BA doesn't have sufficient flexibility. They do bring additional supply to meet the net load uncertainty that is part of that test. Should this full quantity be protected, or should some of that uncertainty supply be made available or pooled in some way to try to cure a capacity deficient BAA? I think when you start talking about that, it does raise the risk for all the other BAAs. So that's something we'd want to be very careful about. Maybe the answer is just the full quantity should be protected and the residual capacity should be calculated based off assuming all of that uncertainty should stay within the BAA, but that's a topic at least I wanted to raise. So that's all I had. Are there any other questions? I think Christina has a next step slide. I would ask that when when stakeholders think through their comments and submit, please try to keep in mind that we're doing kind of two different things here. We're looking to see what is feasibly implementable and what is a preferred design that could be in place in the summer of 2022. Well, also, we're trying to solicit feedback that will inform the phase 2 stakeholder process of what does the more long-term non-interim design look like. So to the extent that they're the same, great, but if entities have different positions on what is acceptable on an interim basis versus what they would like to see on a long-term basis, please let us know. And I see one more question from Libby.
And I know Lindsay also has her hand raised as well. I think Lindsay had her hand raised. Let's go to Lindsay and then we'll go to Libby.
Hi, sorry. This is Lindsay Schluckroyd from Lindsay Energy. I just wanted to note on your last slide, Danny, another thing that's that I've been thinking about with this discussion, with the two good points that were brought up from Brad and John earlier, is that maybe we need to think about some sort of escalating approach for leaning if it were to occur, or if an entity uses this frequently, and maybe that needs to be defined, to your point. And then also, maybe there needs to be some sort of qualifying event, like Brad said, to be able to utilize this sort of tool. I don't know if we would need both of those approaches. Maybe just one satisfies the leaning or the infrequently used kind of part of our proposal, but I definitely think it's something that we should consider.
Thanks, Lindsay. All right, let's go to Libby.
Thanks. This is Libby from BPA again. I just wanted to check, Danny, on that last question on the additional considerations. I want to make sure I understand that question. Is the question whether or not ABC in sufficient VAs should be counted in some way, whether or not that could help the insufficient VA? Or are you asking something about what the assumptions should be about the insufficient VA's ABC?
I think it would be both, right? Like, to the extent that there's ABC in an insufficient VAA, should they be expected to utilize all of that before getting emergency transfers? And then the other question would be, to the extent that other EIM or WEIM VAAs have ABC that they're holding on the market for emergency events, would that be something that they would be willing to make available through the EIM? And I'm not sure what the mechanism for that would be. But to cure resource insufficiency, I imagine in a bilateral framework, to the extent that a BAA has emergency reserve capacity, they may make that available for a neighbor in need in an emergency. So what would be the expectation when moving that into the WEIM paradigm?
Okay, thank you for clarifying. And thanks to both Kaito and NV for letting us out today. It's really helpful. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Libby. Any other questions? Yeah, looks like either Jeff or Mark. Go ahead and open up Mark's line, Sarah.
Thanks, Christina. It's Jeff Spires again. And thanks to Lindsay for walking through the proposal and the examples. Just a couple of thoughts. I think on the last topic, Danny, that you were raising around looking at uncertainty in ABC, I think Mark Holman probably already addressed our perspective earlier, but I think we certainly don't want this type of proposal to cause other entities to end up becoming short. But I think we also don't want to bring them right to the edge of being short. And so looking at things like ABC or uncertainty in other BAs, I think trying to be conservative and not taking too aggressive of a calculation that might end up putting that other BA in an uncomfortable position is better. So that's just kind of my thought on the ABC and the uncertainty, that I think I agree with what you were sort of suggesting of leaving that alone, so to speak. I also appreciated the example that Lindsay walked through and the additional detail Robert provided. It really does seem to me that technically speaking, the structure of what NV is proposing has some elements to it that are very comparable to what already exists today in the software, where you already have the import limitation and the solution could be implemented by adjusting the penalty price to be something below the power balance relaxation as Lindsay was walking through. So it seems as though technically this is achievable. And I know, Danny, you had made some comments that there's some more research for the CAISO to do, but just on the surface from understanding what Lindsay was walking through, it does seem like that approach could be viable on a shorter term basis. And so I think from our point of view, we are open to looking at this type of proposal, particularly if it has the appropriate limitations in place, as have been discussed here, where we ensure that the other BAs are not exposed to becoming short, and that there are potentially some other approaches to limit the use of the emergency assistant, perhaps to only entities that are actually in an emergency, or other methods along those lines to try to limit the use. And just the last point I would make is that this type of solution we would view as being interim, and we'd like to see a commitment to a longer discussion around a more durable solution, including evaluating PowerX's proposal that has similar elements but different details that we would want to discuss more fully during the stakeholder initiative.
Thank you, Jeff. Danny, I didn't know if you were trying to comment.
No, I was going to let you walk through the next step. Thank you, Jeff, for your comment. I agree that anything we'd look to do for this summer would be interim, and then we would look to have a more robust discussion going forward.
Thanks.
All right, and Libby, did you have another question? Where's your hand up from before? Nope. Okay. Well, like Danny said, we are looking for written comments on today's presentation and discussion. Those are going to be due by April 1st. We do appreciate if you could submit those on time so we can continue to work on an implementable solution. So we will work to get a template out there by end of today so that you can start drafting your comments. And then just one more thing, not sure if you all heard, but the ISO is going to be hosting the Stakeholder Symposium this year. We're going to have it at the State Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento, which is the same location as it was before. I think it's been remodeled since we last met there. But the symposium will be on November 9th and 10th, so mark your calendars. We will be setting up the registration site, and we'll send out a public notice once that site's available. So look for that sometime in May. And then just added a link here for additional information. And then if you have any questions, of course, you can send those to the symposiumreg@CAISO.com mailbox, and we'll get back to you. So any other questions or comments before we conclude the call today?
I would like to add one thing, Christina. I apologize for the short turnaround on the comment deadline, but in trying to get something in place for this upcoming summer, we are giving about a week less than we'd like to, but this is just to allow us to get comments to try to formulate how to proceed forward to try to meet the onrushing deadline. So I apologize, and thank you for getting to us what you're able to by next Friday.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your participation in the call today. Again, presentation that we reviewed is out on the initiative webpage, and then once we have the recording from the vendor, we'll post that out on the site as well. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.